What we can measure, we can improve. And therefore, when we look at any business, we want to hold it accountable to certain metrics, both relevant to the outputs as well as the inputs. So the idea for today is accountability of businesses. And so when we say that, we mean how are we able to measure, gauge, or test the progress and success of any particular business that we look at. And so we like to think of this in two categories: output-driven metrics as well as input-driven metrics. And so we'll look at output-driven metrics first. And so when we think of outputs, we look at yields of a business in terms of what comes out of it. And so we either say holding a business accountable or gauging the progress of a business dependent on things that are coming out of the business or are the result of the efforts of the business. So examples of this are revenue growth, profit margins, whether gross profit margins or net profit margins, EBITDA growth or pre-tax profit growth over a period of time. And these are some of the quantitative output-driven metrics. And now when we think of the qualitative metrics, we think of things that aren't necessarily on the P&L, but ultimately flow into it. And so when we think of that, we say customer acquisitions, new leads in the funnel, employee headcount, and other similar metrics. So again, these are all outputs, products of a growing business, or things you can gauge to determine at what rate or how much a business is growing. And then within that, we have quantitative, so things that are going to directly show up on the P&L, and qualitative, or things that will indicate a trajectory or directionally where a company is going. Next, we want to look at input-driven metrics. And so the output-driven metrics are some of the more readily tangible things that come to mind when people say, how can you gauge or test whether a business is moving in the right direction? We also like to think of it as input, because ultimately it is the inputs that yield the outputs. And so what do we mean by this is, if you wanted to gauge how good of shape someone was going to be in after a particular period of time, if you looked at the inputs in terms of what they ate every day and how often they exercised and to what degree, you would have a good indication as to directionally if this individual is moving in the right direction for their health goals. And so we think of business very much the same way. How many times did you show up to the gym? What did you eat every day? And over an iterative process that will yield good results. When we think of sales in a business, for instance, we'll look at how many calls were made, how many emails were sent, how many outbounds were made, how many conferences were attended, how many business cards that you collect at a particular event. And so when we think of metrics from an input perspective, we're looking at it somewhat agnostic of the ultimate yield, because it's been our experience that enough good inputs in the right direction will yield good outputs. Now, they have to be in an intelligent manner done. It can't just be throwing things out to the universe. But when you think of all business starting with sales, all business starting with some sort of a funnel that leads from a prospect to a client to revenue, then oftentimes, if you can gauge how that funnel is filling up, how many new entrants are there, how many people are getting pulled through to each stage, then that's an input-driven metric, but very correlated to the ultimate success of a business. And it's worth thinking of this in the sense of the inputs can have negative yields, but over time have positive yields. And so if you think of who's going to catch the fish, a good indicator of that is who has the most lines in the water, who has had the lines in the water the longest, who is doing the most iterations of attempts. And so you think of sports, you'd say the person with the most shots on goal or the shots at the basket will ultimately have the most points. Now, over time, you want to see that efficacy or the percentage of success rate increase. However, from a very fundamental perspective, it is how many iterations are you getting? And so when we think of business, we say it doesn't matter that any particular sales effort may yield a no or an hey, we're not interested. But if I were to look at companies across the board and say who gets the most no's, right? So who is driving that iterative input to the highest degree? Ultimately, that person or that firm or that company will improve the most, all other things equal, and ultimately yield the best results. Again, it has to be pointed in the right direction, but the concept remains. And so that's the thought for today. Accountability within a business must be driven by measurable metrics, both relevant to outputs as well as inputs. Hope the week's going well for everyone. Keep pushing forward. God bless. We'll see you for next time.